In this video, we're going to start to build models using Django, and we're going to see what models are and how you can use them to create tables in the underlying database that you're using in your application. We're going to see how you can add fields to models to define what type of data you want to store and also the data type of that data. We'll also see how you can create foreign keys between two Django models to link them together in the underlying database. And we'll see how to use Django migrations in order to actually alter the database as you're developing your application. Finally, in this video, we're going to see how you can add choices to a field in Django and how you can register your models with Django's admin interface. So let's get started. I have open here a page on Django's models. We're going to reference that in a second, but let's start by actually creating a virtual environment with Python and installing Django and creating a project. Now feel free to skip this setup process if you already know how to set up a Django project. Check the sections that we've got in the description of this video. So I've got a terminal open here and I'm going to run this command python-m, and we're going to use the venv module, and I'm going to create a virtual environment called venv-orm. And once that's been created, we can go to the virtual environment and activate it. Now I'm on Windows, so you can run this script/activate command. If you're on a Mac or Linux, you would use the source command and you would go to the bin directory rather than the scripts directory. Once it's activated, what we're going to do is upgrade pip to begin with the pip install -u pip command. That's a good practice whenever you create an environment in Python. You want to upgrade pip and then you can do your installations. Once pip has been upgraded, what we're going to do is install Django and also another package called Django-extensions, which I use in most Django projects. And we're going to use Django extensions throughout this series in order to run the shell plus command and also to see another command called run script. We'll see more about that in future videos. Once that's been installed, I'm going to clear the terminal, and what I'm going to do is run the Django-admin command, and we're going to start a new project. Let's call that project ORM series. That will create a directory and a Django project which we can then cd into, and we can then run the python manage.py start app command, and we can create a generic app that we're just going to call core. Of course, in a real application you might want to give it a better name than that, but we're just going to call it core. And what we're going to do now is I'm going to go to VS Code and actually open this new application, this new project in VS Code. So I've now got this project open in VS Code. You can see we have the project directory, it's called ORM series, and we also have the core application that we just created that contains a file called models.py, and that's the file that we're going to use to actually define the models in this Django application. But there's a couple of extra setup steps to do here. I'm going to go to the project settings.py file, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to remove the comment at the top, and I'm going to go to the installed apps here, and we're going to add both Django extensions to installed apps and also that core application that we've just created. That's a custom app that we have here in the project. We're going to add that to installed apps. And now we can get started with building some models. So I'm going to open the models.py file, and as you can see we've got an import at the top. From the Django DB module we're importing models, and at this point I'm going to go to the documentation page on models so we can see what these actually are. Now, as it says, a model is a single definitive source of information about your data. It contains the essential fields and the behaviours of the data that you're storing in the database. And importantly, generally each model in your Django application, each one of those is going to map to a single table in the underlying database. So there's a one-to-one relationship between a model and a table in the database. So each model represents a table in a way. And Django models are Python classes that subclass the Django model object, and each attribute of the model represents a database field or a column in the underlying database table. And a quick example is shown below where we have a class called person, so the model name is person and it inherits from Django's model class. And this model defines two fields that are both character fields, and these are for the person's first name and their last name. So first name and last name here, these are fields on the model and they map to columns in the underlying database table, and there is a table in the database for people, for person, and the person model maps to one underlying table in the database. And if we scroll down a bit, you can see there's a create table statement that's executed whenever you run a migration against this model, and this statement creates a table called myapp_person, and that is basically the name of the application with an underscore and then the name of the model that you're actually creating. The combination of those is by default the name of the table that's created in the database, and of course because you've defined two fields here called first name and last name, these are represented here in the create table statement as columns in this table, and you can see they have a type of varchar, and the reason they're set to varchar is because we've defined the field type to be a models.charField, and a char field is basically a variable length character field, and that's mapped to a type in the underlying database, and in this case it's a varchar type. You can also see something that's quite important to know about, and that's that if you do not define explicitly a primary key on the model class, then Django will create one for you, and you can see that in this line of code here. We are creating an ID which is of type big int, and you can see the primary key keyword here, so it's creating that particular column implicitly and adding it to the model, or adding it to the underlying table as the primary key of that table. Now this create table syntax is, as you can see below, it's formatted using PostgreSQL syntax, and PostgreSQL is a particular type of database, but it's important to note that Django will use SQL that's tailored to whatever the backend is in your settings.py file. So let's quickly go back to VS Code, and we're going to go to the settings.py file, and we've already changed this to add a couple of installed apps, but if we scroll down a bit further, you can see we have here a databases setting, and this is the setting that will define the database backend that you're using in your application, and by default that's just set to a SQLite database. So when you run Django's start project command, you're going to get this configuration here that's going to create a SQLite database unless you change this setting of databases. Now later on in this video series we're going to change this setting so that we can use PostgreSQL, and we're going to see the configuration that we need to connect to a Postgres database. For now we're going to keep it to SQLite, and we're going to go back to the models.py file, and we're actually going to build out some models now for this application. So let's get started, and I'm going to remove the default comment that we have in this file, and I'm going to put another comment here that's going to outline the models we want to build in this application. So let's say we're building a restaurant management system, and we're going to keep track of all of the different restaurants that we have in the system, and we're also going to have the concept of a user in this application, and users can give restaurants ratings between 1 and 5 stars. So some of the models we're going to need here are, for example, a restaurant model, we're going to need a user model, and we're also going to need a rating model to begin with. Now we are going to add some more models in this series, but let's start with these, and we're going to start by building out the restaurant model. So what we do is define a Python class, and that is going to inherit from Django's model class. So it's the models.model class. And remember, we've imported models here on line 1, and we're referencing the model class in that module, and we're subclassing it to create this Django model called restaurant. So this is the model class, and remember that typically this is going to map to an underlying database table. We're going to see that a little bit later in this video when we actually perform what's called a migration to create the table in the underlying database. But what we also need to do in this model is define some fields. And fields represent columns in the database table. So for a restaurant, we want to store the name of the restaurant in the database. We're going to make that a models.CharField, and that's a character field. And we can give that a keyword argument of max length, and that's going to constrain the length of the data we can input into that particular field. So let's say for the name of a restaurant, we want to put the max length equal to 100 characters. So this line of code on line 9, that's a field that exists in the model, and that will be mapped to a column in the underlying database table, and the column will be called whatever we call the name of the field. In this case it is called name. So at this point I'm going to go to the Django documentation, and we're going to go to the model field reference. This is a page that contains data on all of the different fields that are included in Django by default. I'm going to leave a link to this and to the previous page on models just below the video. On the right hand sidebar you can see some of the keyword arguments or options that you can pass to these model fields, and we also have field types defined below here. And these field types are what we're defining right now. For example, we've just defined a car field. We can also define things such as Boolean fields to store true and false values. We have file fields that can store references to files in the database, and we also have things such as integer fields and floating point number fields to store numerical values. And we also have date fields and date time fields to store date objects and date time objects, and many more as well. Now what I'm going to do at the moment is create a URL field. Let's imagine that these restaurants in the system, they can have websites. So let's create another field called website, and that's going to be equal to a models.url field. Now let's not require all restaurants to define a website. Some of them might not have websites, so we're going to give this a default value of an empty string. And we're going to see later on when we create the table from this model that a URL field is just a subclass of a car field. In the underlying database, the data type is going to be a varchar, but the URL field will perform some additional validation when we try to enter data via a Django form. And that validation is just going to check that the characters that are entered into the car field, they have a particular format that matches what a URL would be. So let's move on. We're going to create a new field in this Django model, and it's going to be called date opened. So let's imagine that we want to capture the date that a restaurant was opened, and we're going to use a models.date field to do this. And in the underlying database, again, that's going to map to a particular data type, in this case, a data type that can store dates. And finally, for now, let's define a latitude column, and that's going to store the latitude of where the restaurant is located, and that's going to be a models.float field, and that will enable us to store a floating point number for that latitude. And I'm going to copy that line below and also define one for the longitude. So these are both floating point numbers, and they can be used to capture the location of a restaurant. We're going to use that extensively later in the series when we look at Django and other tools such as that. Now what we can also do, just to finish up this model for now, is we can define a method on the model, and let's define this method called dunderString, and that will take self as an argument, and that's because dunderString is an instance method. So when we have an instance of the restaurant, what do we want to see when we are trying to display that instance? That's basically what the dunderString method is going to do. We return a value. In this case, we're going to return self.name, and that's going to output the name of the restaurant. So this is our basic Django model for a restaurant, and this will be mapped to a table in the database. We are going to add more fields to this later in the video, or rather later in the series, but for now we're going to go with this. So this is our model. The question is, how do we actually take this model and create the underlying database table? And the answer to this is we are going to have to perform a migration in order to do that. So what I'm going to do is go back to Django's documentation, and we're going to go to this page on migrations. And as you can see, migrations are Django's way of propagating changes that you make to your models into the database schema. And changes you might make include adding a new model to your application or deleting a model. You might also take an existing model and add new fields to that model or delete existing fields. These are all changes that you're making, and these should be reflected in the underlying database. In order to actually make the changes in the database, you're going to need to make a migration and then migrate the changes to the database. And Django provides you with several manage.py commands that you can use to interact with the underlying database. And the top two here are the most common, the migrate command. This is responsible for applying and unapplying migrations. So when you actually want to make the change to the underlying system, you need to run the migrate command. And below that we have a make migrations command. This is responsible for actually creating the new migration files based on changes that you've made to your models. And the workflow for these is typically you will make a change to your Django model. You will then run the make migrations command, which creates a migration file in your system. And finally, once you're ready to actually make the change to the database, you will run the migrate command. We're about to see this workflow now. So let's go back to VS Code. And at the bottom here, I have the virtual environment activated. What I'm going to do is run a command. It's going to be python manage.py. And what we need to run is the make migrations command. So let's try that out. And you can see it's created a migration called 001 initial.py. And in that migration, we have a message here saying that we've created a model called restaurant. And of course, we have done that. We've done it here in this models.py file. And that model has been detected when we run the make migrations command. And if we go to the core application, you can see we have a migrations directory, and we now have this file called 001 initial.py. So this is the migration file, and it basically captures a change set of what we're going to do to the database when we run the migrate command. And you can see we have a migrations.create model statement here, and we're creating this model called restaurant, and it has these given fields here. And this is going to propagate this change to the database when we run the migrate command. So let's clear out the terminal, and we're going to run a new command here, and it's going to be python manage.py, and then the command is migrate, and that's going to create the database itself if we run it for the first time, and it's also going to create any tables that we need in our application. And you can see it's applying various migrations here, and some of these migrations come from built-in Django applications. What you should note though is that on the left hand sidebar we now have a db.SQLite file, and that was not there before. So when we run the migrate command, it's going to create the database for us if it's a SQLite database, and it's going to then add all of the tables that we have in our applications to that database. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to open up the DB browser for SQLite that we've seen in the introductory video, and I'm going to open a database. And this is the new database that was just created by the migrate command. So let's open that up. And you can see we get a bunch of tables here, 12 tables in this database, and we can ignore the indices for now. But what we're going to do is we're going to look at the core restaurant table, and that is the table that has been created by the restaurant model that we just added to the application. And as you can see, this restaurant table, it contains columns for each of the fields that we added to the model. For example, name, website, date opened, latitude and longitude, but we don't have any rows in the data, and that's because of course we've just created the table and there's no data in that table until we explicitly add that data. And remember from earlier, we also have an ID column, and that's the primary key of the database. If we inspect the schema by going to Modified Table, you can see the ID column here has the PK ticked as well as the auto increment section ticked as well. And you can also see here that the name and website fields, they're both varchar data types, and the varchar fields have numbers in these brackets, 100 for the name and 200 for the website. 200 is the default for a char field in Django, but if we go back to our models.py file, you can see that 100 is coming from the max length keyword argument. So when we apply keyword arguments to Django model fields, that can alter the representation of that column in the underlying database. For example, by applying constraints such as a unique constraint or a null constraint. Now we added one model to this Django application, but we have 12 tables. And remember, there's a one-to-one relationship typically between a model and a table. So where are the other tables coming from? You can see that the prefix of the table name contains the name of the application in which the model was defined. For example, core restaurant, we defined a class called restaurant, and that was in the core application. We have a bunch of tables at the top from an application called auth, and that's a built-in Django application that is by default added to your settings.installed apps. So let's go back to that and scroll up to installed apps. You can see at the top here we have a django.contrib.auth application in this installed apps list. And this built-in Django application contains some models that we can use. For example, as you can see, an auth user table. There is a user model built into Django. We're going to see a bit more about that very soon. And we also have tables for groups and permissions in the Django system. We're going to see a little bit of those throughout this series. Let's right-click the auth user model and browse the table. You can see that the built-in default Django user model contains fields such as a password field, last login, username, email, and so on. And we're going to use the Django user model now. If we go back to VS Code, what I'm going to do now is go to models.py. And you can see at the top the three models we want to create in this video. We have also a user model, so we're going to use the default Django user model, and I can import that at the top, and it's going to be from django.contrib.auth.models. That's the models module of that auth application, and from there we can import the user model. Now you should only start a Django project with the user model that's built in if you're confident that you want to use that user model and you don't need to change anything. We're just going to follow along and assume that we're going to use the built-in default user model in this series. And what we're going to do now is create a rating model that we're going to use to store a user's ratings for different restaurants in the system. So the rating model is going to store a reference to the user who created the rating and also the restaurant to which the rating applies to. So we're going to need to create a model called rating that contains two foreign keys to those two different tables. So let's go below the restaurant model and create a new Python class called rating, and again that's going to inherit from the models.model class. And let's now define the fields that are going to be on this model. For example, we're going to have a user model, and that's going to be equal to a models.foreign_key field. And as we said in the last video, a foreign key allows you to take one table and link it to a parent table. In this case, we're going to link it to the user table, and we can do that by specifying as a first argument to foreign key the model that we want to link it to, in this case the user model. And we need a keyword argument called onDelete in order to specify what happens when the parent model is deleted. What do we want to happen to the reference here in the rating model? And in our case, what we're going to say is models.cascade. And what models.cascade means is that if the parent model, the user, is deleted from the database, then that deletion is going to cascade down and delete the associated rating for that user or any ratings that they have in the rating table. So essentially, when you specify models.cascade for the onDelete keyword argument of a foreign key, what you're saying is that when the parent is deleted, we want to also delete this child instance or any child instance that is linked to that parent. So this is how you specify that relationship in a Django model. You use the models.foreignKey class on a child object to link it to a parent object of some sort, in this case the user model, and we're going to do the same for the restaurant. A rating belongs to a restaurant, so we need to link it to a parent restaurant model. I'm going to copy this line of code down below, and we're going to change the model that's referenced as the first argument to the foreign key. In this case, we want to link the foreign key to the restaurant model, and we're also going to change the name of the field here, and that's going to be restaurant. So here we have a rating model with two foreign keys, one to the user table and another foreign key to the restaurant table. And what we also need to store, of course, is the actual rating. And we want to store a rating, let's say between 1 and 5. So let's define a new field here called rating, and that's going to be equal to a models.positive small integer field. Now we could have used a normal integer field, but we know the rating should be between 1 and 5. We know that number is quite small. We don't need to store a large range of integers in this column. So we're going to make it a positive small integer field, and that will cut down a little on the space that's used in the underlying database for that column. And finally, to the rating model, I'm going to add a dunder string method that returns the rating as a number here. And that's all we need for the rating model at the moment. Now again, how do we actually create this table in the underlying database? If we go to the database browser for SQLite, you can see that the core application at the moment only has one table, and that's the restaurant table that we created earlier. So in order to create the rating table, we need to make the migrations that's going to detect anything that's changed in the models.py file, and then once we've got those changes, we run the migrate command. So let's go back to VS Code, and I'm going to rerun the make migrations command, and we can see the output of that has created a model called rating. After we've done that, we can then run the migrate command, and you can see that it's applying that migration file, and that should now have created the database table. And if we go to the database browser for SQLite and we refresh this, and you can just press Command or Control R in order to refresh that database, but you can now see we have a core rating table, and it contains these fields. We have an ID, the auto-generated primary key that Django generates for us. We also have the rating, which was the positive small integer field, and we have the two foreign keys, the restaurant ID and the user ID. And you can see that for the foreign keys, we specified a name of restaurant and user for these fields. So the names are restaurant and user, as you can see on the model, but when we look at the database column, it's added the ID to the end of that field name, and that's because this is essentially referencing an ID in another table. So Django automatically adds that ID to the end of the field name for us, and when we're querying against these objects, it's going to do that automatically too. And if we go back to the database structure and look at the rating and click modify table, you can see that we are creating the foreign key in the create table SQL statement. And if we go to the right hand side, you can see these foreign keys. And for the restaurant ID, that's referencing the core restaurant tables ID column. And for the user ID, we're referencing the auth user tables ID column. And that's how these foreign keys are taken from the model and applied to the underlying database table by Django. So let's move on. We're going to see how to define choices in a Django model now, and these can be used on a field to limit the values that can be entered into that field from Django forms that are on the front end. So let's go back to the documentation, and I'm going to open this page here. I'll link this below the video. This is on enumeration types, and Django provides these enumeration types that allow you to define choices in a concise way. And you can see below we have a class called student. This is a Django model, and we have an inner class called year in school. And this inner class inherits from models.TextChoices, and this is a class that subclasses Python's enum class, and you can use that to define some choices that you want to apply to a particular field in your Django model. So for year in school, we have choices such as freshman, junior, and so on. And you can see below that we define a CharField where we have a keyword argument called choices, and we refer to the name of that text choice class and then the choices attribute of that class. We're going to do that now in our Django model for the restaurants. So let's go back to VS Code, and we're going to scroll up here, and we're going to define a new class here within the restaurant model. And this class is going to capture the type of food, the type of cuisine that the restaurant offers. For example, Italian or Mexican and so on. So let's define a class here called type choices, and that's going to inherit from Django's models.TextChoices class. And then within that class we can define the actual choices themselves, the fields. So let's say we want to start with Indian restaurants. We define a field called Indian, that's the name of the enum value. And then we refer to a tuple here, and the first value of that tuple is the actual string value that's stored in the database. So this is the choice value that's going to actually be put into the database column. And the second value here is going to be the human readable string that's going to be used on any Django forms that you display on your front end. So that's for Indian restaurants. Let's imagine we have a Chinese restaurant now, and we use the prefix CH, that's what we're storing in the database, and the human readable value will be Chinese here, And these prefixes, I'm just using these because they don't take long to type, but we could store anything we want in the database. Any text will do, so we could also store the raw values themselves, but I'm just going to store these prefixes. And let's define one more before I copy paste a lot of these. Let's say we have Italian restaurants. We're going to use the prefix IT for the database value, and for the human readable value we can use Italian. I'm going to now paste some more of these in. We have Greek restaurants, Mexican, fast food, and other. So this is our Python class that is subclassing the Django TextChoices class, and this defines all of the choices we want to apply. We now need to link that to a column in our database, and we're going to create a new column now, a new field in this Django model, and let's call that field restaurant type. And the restaurant type field is going to be a models.CharField, and that's because even though we're using these text choices, the underlying values are just going to be characters, so we're going to use a CharField for that. And because all of our prefixes have the length of 2, we can specify a max length of 2 for this CharField, and then we can link the CharField to the choices by using the choices keyword argument, and the value of that can refer to the class of type choices, which has an attribute called choices, and that choices attribute will then use these choices when we define Django forms based on this model, and we'll maybe see more of that later on. So now that we've added a new field to the Django model, of course we need to create the migration. So first of all, let's run the make migrations command, and we get a message now that it's impossible to add a non-nullable field restaurant type to the model without specifying a default value. And that's because the database needs something to populate any existing rows. So what we're going to do is provide a one-off default value, and we're just going to use an empty string. We don't have any rows anyway, so this isn't going to matter much. But it's important to know that if you're adding a new column to a database table and that column cannot be nullable, if you have existing rows in the table, you need to specify what values are going to be put into this new column when you create it. So after we've done that, you can see the migration message below that we've added the field restaurant type to the restaurant model. So what we can now do is run the migrate command, and that's going to then add that new column to the restaurant table. If we go back to DB browser and we right click core restaurant and browse the table, you can see at the right hand side we now have a restaurant type column that's appeared in this table. So just to reiterate the workflow, when you change a Django model, you're going to make the migration, and that's going to create a file that specifies all of the changes that need to be applied to the database. Once you've done that, you can then use the migrate command, and that's going to apply those changes to your database schema. So we're nearly done with this video. I'm going to define one more Django model in this video, and then we're going to see how to quickly register all our models with Django's admin interface. So let's go back to VS Code, and just below the rating model, I'm going to define a new model. And just before I do that, I can see this _string method is not correctly indented, so we're going to indent that within the rating class. So what we're now going to do is, imagine in this restaurant system, we're also tracking the sales that each restaurant has made. So every single transaction is stored in a table called sale. Now in order to do this, what we need to do is create another Django model, and we're going to call that Sale, and that again is going to inherit from Django's model class. And we want to store 3 bits of information in this database table. We want to store the restaurant which the sale has actually occurred in, and we also want to store the income made from that sale, and also the date, time that the sale occurred. So let's start by linking the sale to a parent restaurant. We can do that again using a foreign key, so we'll use the models.foreign key and link that to the restaurant model. And again, on the deletion of a restaurant, we want to just delete the associated sales. That's probably not what you'd want to do in a real system. You don't want to just disappear your sales. And there are other options you can do. For example, the restaurant can be set to null here. In fact, let's do that. We'll set the value of the restaurant to null. And in order to do that, we also need to specify that this could be a nullable field. We can do that with the null equals true keyword argument. So what will happen now is when a parent restaurant is deleted, instead of models.cascade, which would delete the associated sale, instead the underlying database is going to set the restaurant column to null when the parent restaurant is deleted. And we can do this by telling the underlying table that the restaurant column can be null by setting the null keyword argument to true. So I hope that makes sense. If you want any more clarification on the onDelete parameter, I can make videos on that in this series later on. But what we're going to do now is define a couple of extra fields on the sale model. So let's start by defining an income field, and that's going to track how much was made, how much money was made from the sale, and that's going to be equal to a models.DecimalField. And I'm going to go to Django's documentation for a decimal field. You can see that this is a fixed precision decimal number, and it's represented in Python by a decimal instance, and it takes two required arguments: the maximum number of digits that are allowed in the number, and also the number of decimal places that you want in your number. Now, because we're dealing with money values, we want the number of decimal places to be equal to 2. So let's go back to our model class, and we're going to define the max number of digits. We're going to set that equal to 8, and the number of decimal places, we can use the decimal places keyword argument, and we're going to set that equal to 2. So this field is a decimal field that tracks the income made from the sale. We can define one more field just below that. I'm going to call it datetime, and that's going to be equal to a models.datetime field. Now this is slightly different from the field that we defined on the restaurant, the date opened. We just want that to be a date. We don't care about the time that the restaurant opened, but for a sale you might care about the time, so we're going to make that a date time field. And the difference here is that a date time field will also store the time components of that particular date time. Now hopefully you're getting used to this workflow now. What we need to do after we've changed the models.py file, we need to run the make migrations command, so let's do that. And you can see that we've created a new model called Sale. After we've done that, we can again run the migrate command, and we're going to go back to the database browser for SQLite. You can see the core application has a rating and a restaurant table. If we refresh this page, you can see that it's now added the sale table. So let's right click the sale table, and you can see we have a reference to the income field, the date time field, and also the foreign key to the restaurant. And if we go back to the list of tables and right click the sale table and go to modify table, you can see the data type for the income field is set to decimal. So decimal is a type in the underlying SQLite system. And when we define a models.decimal field in Django, that's going to map to that decimal type in SQLite. So that's all the models we want to create in this first video. We have 3 models: a restaurant model to capture data on restaurants. We also have a rating model, and this model stores data on the ratings that users have given to individual restaurants. And because we're dealing with users, we also have a user model, and for this application we are using Django's built-in user model for that. And finally, if we scroll to the bottom, we have a sale model, and this is a model that tracks all of the transactions or sales that a given restaurant has done, and it tracks the income generated from that sale as well as the time that the sale occurred. So let's finish this video very quickly by going to the core application's admin.py file, and what we're going to do is register all of our new models in Django's admin interface. So let's go to the top here, and we're going to import these models from the core.models module. We're going to import the restaurant model as well as the sale model and also the rating model. And a very simplistic way to register each model in the admin UI is to write this code here, where we write the function admin.site.register, and to the register function we can pass the model that we want to register in Django's admin UI. So here we register the restaurant model, and I'm going to copy this to the lines below, and we can also register the sale model and the rating model. Once we've done that, we can save the admin.py file, and I'm going to go back to the terminal at the bottom here, and I'm going to make this a little bit bigger, and I'm going to run a command called python manage.py create superuser. And the create superuser command allows you to create an admin user in the Django application. So what I'm going to do just before I run this command, I'm going to go back to the database browser. Let's go to the auth user table, and you can see at the moment we have no rows, there are no users in this application. Now the create superuser command is going to create a user in this table, as we're going to see in a second. Let's give them a username of admin. We can give them an email address of admin@test.com, and I'm just going to give them a password of test here. Now a pro tip, if you're developing an application, don't give an admin user the password of test. And once we've created the super user, we can run a new command called run server, and that's going to run Django's development server, and then we can go to the browser and look at the admin UI. So you can go to the admin UI on the browser by looking at localhost 8000/admin by default. And that admin URL is set in the project's URL configuration. So if we go to urls.py and we scroll down here, you can see the path to the admin URLs is the /admin here. So let's go back to the admin interface here, and we're going to log in with this new user that we've just created. And you can see on this left hand side here we have the models that have been registered with the admin UI in the core application. For example, the ratings model, restaurants, and also sales. And if we click through to restaurants, you can see we don't have any restaurants in the database. There is a button at the top right though where we can actually add a new restaurant based on the fields that we defined in the model class. Now let's go back to the home page here and we can look at the users in the application, and you can see we have this user called admin. That's the super user that we just created, and because that's available here in the admin UI, if we go to the database browser for SQLite, you can see at the moment we have no rows, but if we refresh this, we get the new user who is appearing in this database table for users. So when you run the create super user command, it's going to add a user to this user table, and you can see some of the fields here. For example, the email field, they match what was filled out on the terminal when we actually created this super user. Now one last and important thing to note in this video is the password field here. We entered a password of test, but you can see that that has been hashed to a value, and that's important when you're developing web applications. You don't want to store the raw password as text in this database column. Instead, you want to hash the password so that if someone steals your database data or gets access to it, they don't see the actual password that your users have. Instead, they get this version here and they cannot tell what the user is using for their password based on this hash value. And that's important because, of course, this user with this email address might use the same password on multiple sites. So instead of exposing that password here, we have a hashed value, and Django will take care of that for us when we use the create super user command. And it also has on its user model some functions that will take care of hashing the password, and this is a key security issue in a web application. So that's all for this video. In this video we've defined our first Django models. We've got a restaurant model, we've got a rating model and a sale model, and we have fields that are applied to each of these models, and these fields are mapped to columns in the associated tables. We've also seen how to define choices in Django using the TextChoices class, and we've seen how to define models that contain foreign keys to related models. In the next video we're going to dive into how to use Python in Django to actually create rows in the database, and we're going to see how to work with foreign keys and how to query against these foreign keys when we're using Django's ORM. So thank you for watching this video. If you've enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next video.